Hello and welcome back to my channel, everyone. Today I will be covering UFO sightings and alien encounters from the state of Michigan. Before I begin, please make sure to like and comment on this video as it really helps my channel out. You can also click the card on the top right to my playlist of all my paranormal videos to watch more like this one. Thank you to everyone who's been enjoying my videos. So without further ado, let's get into it. Port Huron, Tawas. Weird flying object reported in the area. From the Bay City Times, March 13, 1969. A flying object with green, yellow, and red lights was spotted by at least a dozen persons in Michigan Wednesday night, including 2 members of the East Tawas family. The Tawas sighting, phoned in to a Detroit radio station this morning, occurred about 9 p.m. when a teenage daughter told her mother of a strange light in the northeast. We put our small telescope on it and watched it for nearly an hour, the unidentified woman told radio station WJR disc jockey J.P. McCarthy. It was shaped irregular and seemed to be hovering over Wurtsmith Air Force Base. Base officials reported no unusual activity and said no aircraft was in the area. Downstate, a similar object was reported in the sky over Port Huron, although nearby Selfridge Air Force Base personnel said no aircraft was in the area. They also said they called Selfridge Air Force Base in Mount Clemens, 40 miles southeast, and that an officer told them there were no aircraft in the area. The officer also reported, they said, that a similar object had been spotted in the Mount Clemens area earlier in the evening. It's UFO sighting time again. Look, up in the sky. From the Mount Clemens Macomb Daily, March 13, 1969. Clear spring and summer nights bring numerous reports of unidentified flying objects, and Wednesday was no exception, as several Mount Clemens area residents reported seeing an object with green, yellow, and red lights in the eastern sky. Officials at Selfridge Air Force Base said that they received a call from a Mount Clemens resident and from the St. Clair County Sheriff's Department at about 9:20 p.m. Wednesday. They noted that no aircraft were reported in the area. This object is visible on almost any clear night, one base official said. I don't believe it's anything that should alarm people, because with all the objects in the sky today, it most likely is nothing more than a satellite that is struck by some glare from the sun, she added. SAFB also added that their radar picked up no unusual objects during that night. 2 little girls riding their ponies north of Port Huron about 9:20 p.m. reported to St. Clair County Sheriff's deputies something that looked like a streetlight seemed to be following them. Charles Carl, the father of one of the girls, told the deputies he watched the object through field glasses as it hovered over his home. He described it as having green, yellow, and red lights. His daughter, Debbie, 13, said it had no noise at all. Deputies David Doctor and William Ward said they could see the object from the Carl's yard and followed it northwest to the tiny town of Jeddo, where they lost it. What was it? Light and sky seen here. From the Port Huron Times-Herald, March 13, 1969. They're back. At least 10 persons in the Port Huron area, including 3 young girls who were riding ponies along North River Road, observed what has been classified as an unidentified flying object Wednesday night. Police dispatcher James Schmidt received the first telephone call about 9 p.m. from Brian Carl, 16, of 3812 North River Road. Brian told dispatcher Schmidt that a large light had followed his sister Debbie Carl, 13, home and was hovering over their home. Officer Schmidt radioed the sheriff department, and deputies Robert Johnson and David Doctor responded. Brian and Debbie and their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Carl, were in the yard watching the light when officers arrived. Debbie told the officers that she first saw the light as she and her companions were riding their ponies along the shoulder of the road. Both the deputies observed the light in the sky as they arrived. Debbie said she was riding on Dykeman Road when the light that seemed to look like a large streetlight with a tail began to follow them. She said there was no noise. She said the light followed the girls right to her home and seemed to hang over the house as she ran to get her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Carl said that when Debbie came into the house, she seemed frightened and panicky and asked her to come out into the front yard. Mrs. Carl said the light stayed over their home for about 2 hours and didn't move. About 9:20 p.m., it began to move away slowly and looked like a ball of fire with strands of fire coming out of it. There was no noise, and it was quite high up. When it was overhead, it was a brilliant white light, and it had prongs on it that appeared to be red, green, and yellow. When it started to leave, it began to change color. It was a lot lower than the stars. I didn't believe in this kind of stuff before, but it was there. Definitely there was something out there, Mrs. Carl said. Mr. Carl told officers he watched the light through his binoculars, and he told officers it also had green, yellow, and red lights on it. Deputies Johnson and Doctor said they could see the object from the Carl yard and followed it north to the Jetto area where they lost sight of it. Many persons claimed the light in the sky was just an airplane from Selfridge, but it wasn't. An official at Selfridge Air Force Base reported there were no planes from the base in the area. However, he did say that Selfridge had received similar reports from the Mount Clemens area that a UFO had been observed there too. UFO reports flood area. Hale couple chased by flying object. From the Bay City Times, March 15, 1969. One sure sign of spring is the annual upswing of flying saucer sightings, and judging from the reports of a Hale, Michigan couple, spring has already arrived. According to Mr. and Mrs. Larry Johnson, a brightly lighted, cigar-shaped object chased their speeding auto through rural Iosco County Thursday night. I don't know what it was, says Johnson, but it was just above the trees and stayed right with us. Johnson, 21, a Bay City Times circulation driver, was north of Hale with his wife Vicky, 20, when they noticed a green and yellow light in the northeast sky. We were on our way home from visiting relatives, Johnson said, when Vicky saw it over towards Sand Lake. It was larger than a star and was green and yellow in color. The couple decided to drive to the lake for a closer look. We lost sight of it a couple of times as we rounded the curves on Esmond Road, Mrs. Johnson said, but we saw enough of it to tell it was moving. When we got to the lake, it looked like it was over Tawas. They watched the light for about 5 minutes and then decided to turn back toward Hale. About 2 miles from the lake, however, they say a strange feeling came over them. We were looking out the side and front windows, wondering where it went, Mrs. Johnson says, when we got this creepy feeling like we were being watched. Then I turned and saw it. It was like a fluorescent glow, she continued, only a quarter mile behind us and just above the treetops. It was pale green on the bottom and a blinding yellow on top. We couldn't see any metal or anything, but that's probably because the thing was so bright. Johnson says he took one look and accelerated his car. It was really scary. There's no houses out there, just the woods, and I wasn't going to take any chances, he explains. They say the light followed them for about 5 miles and then suddenly stopped as they neared Hale. All of a sudden, it shot straight up in the air, Mrs. Johnson recalled. They lost sight of the light then, but spotted it again when they reached home a few minutes later. It was only a speck of light, kind of greenish-yellow in color, Larry says, and for a second we thought it was a star, but then it just suddenly took off and vanished. Neither were sure what they saw, and they were reluctant to label it a flying saucer. "All I can say is that it was the weirdest thing I ever saw," Johnson said Friday. "You hear about these kinds of things, but just don't believe it unless it happens to you." Police agencies in Michigan, however, are well aware that people see these things. One of dozens of reports about UFOs received over the past week, the Johnson's sighting was checked out by police to no avail. Meanwhile, UFO sightings continue to be reported. UFO sighting changes skeptic. From the Saginaw News, October 11, 1970. It had just stopped raining. The sky was cloudy under the pitch of night. Roger G. J.O. wheeled his car onto M15 and started on the last leg of his homeward journey to Bay City with only the company of his blaring radio. Then it happened. Two brightly lighted, round discs flashed up ahead of his car and whisked overhead, traveling southward. The radio buzzed with static. J.O. stepped on the accelerator. It lasted for only 4 to 6 seconds, says J.O., but it seemed like a day. When I saw the first one, it appeared to be about 25 feet in diameter and about 50 feet up. His radio made a sound similar to the one made when a car travels near or under high-tension wires, J.O. says. The first object left the Bay City industrial worker bewildered. The second convinced him, he says, that it was something more than just lights. So he headed for the Bay County Sheriff's Department and filed a report. The incident took place at 2:15 a.m. Saturday as J.O. headed home from Cairo, where he plays in a band on weekends. The objects were traveling between 100 and 150 miles an hour, and were intensely bright with light emanating from the center towards the disk's edges, where there was a greenish-blue haze, according to J.O. He didn't hear a sound from them. The incident left him nervous, says his wife. Sometimes he comes home from the band late, says Mrs. J.O., and I always ask him where he's been. This time he said, "You won't believe me." J.O. says a deputy at the sheriff's department took him quite seriously and said he had worked on the Air Force's unidentified flying object team when in the service. I drew a picture for him and he called the radar installation at Port Austin. They told him they could neither deny or confirm the sighting. An official from the 754th Radar Squadron at Port Austin Saturday said equipment had not picked up anything unusual. Major Marvin S. Heller said, however, the facility would not have picked up objects flying low because of ground clutter and the long distance to M15. Other police agencies also said they had not received calls from anyone else reporting objects in the sky. A check of police agencies in the Thumb area turned up nothing out of the ordinary for a Friday night. But one deputy from the Huron County Sheriff's Department said, "We usually do get some reports like that at this time of the year, usually in September or October. I know I saw something like a bright disk like that here a couple of years ago." The two objects J.O. reported came over his car about 2 miles south of M38 on M15. His phone kept ringing all day Saturday after the incident was reported by news media. He was interviewed by a radio and television station. "I really haven't gotten any sleep. When he came in the house, I thought he had been in an accident or something," says his wife. "Before, when I would read him articles about flying saucers, he would just scoff. And now? I don't know what it was, but it was something," says J.O. "I believe there was something there. I know there was. Thank God this isn't something that happens every day, and I'll be darn glad if it doesn't happen again. Wow." UFOs sighted in Richmond area? From the Richmond Review, December 10, 1971. Starlight, star bright. Who's going to see the space folk tonight? Look skyward, people. That's where the action is, according to John Baker, Gary Petriowski, and Chuck Snyder, local residents. Several weeks ago, these three stalwarts, who claim to have been sober at the time, sighted a UFO on Kroner Road in Columbus Township. It looked like a car, said John Baker, except the hood hump was in the back of the vehicle. It had blinking red, green, and white lights, made a heavy droning noise, and hovered between 50 and 100 yards overhead. I thought it might land, he explained. I got scared and took off. As we tracked back 2 or 3 miles down Kroner, it turned and followed us. At that point, we saw cars approaching from the other direction, and the UFO disappeared, traveling in a sideways direction. It was all lights and made a droning jet sound, but not loud, recalled Gary Petriowski. Chuck Snyder describes the sound as an intensely high-pitched hum. Looking up at the object in its hovering position, it appeared as wide as the road, he stated. It probably would have been much bigger at ground level. The thing itself was shadowed out because the lights were so bright, he claimed. It stayed in one place with the lights tilted at a slight angle, and I thought maybe it was turning in a circle. It couldn't have been a jet or a helicopter, continued Snyder. I know how those sound. If the Air Force is behind this thing, they should notify the public, he states emphatically. An older person in poor health could die of fright after an experience like that. I was real scared myself, he laughed, but curious at the same time. I wanted to see what it was. When the oncoming cars drew closer, the UFO moved 100 yards to the side in a northeast direction and then disappeared with an unbelievable burst of speed. In an instant, there was nothing. It was like a light turning out, but faster. I never believed in UFOs before this happened, said Snyder, but 3 people just can't imagine the same thing at the same time. It happened all right, and we saw it. John seldom talks much, Mrs. Baker told the Review, but the night of the sighting he was so exhilarated and excited that he couldn't stop talking. He's a quiet boy, said Mr. Baker, but this was a most unusual experience for him. I believe he is reporting the incident accurately. Balls of fire and comet tails. Should we scoff or accept the account? At one time, any adult American who expressed a degree of belief in the possibility of flying saucers or other space phenomena was regarded as an oddity and a crackpot, but attitudes have changed subtly on the subject. A review survey of the local citizenry reveals there are more believers in interstellar activities than non-believers. Even though our astronauts found the moon underpopulated, inhospitable, and slightly less desirable than Miami Beach, Earthlings insist on believing there's something out there, and refuse to accept the theory of dead space. It seems to be no longer a case of are there UFOs, but rather, whose UFOs are they? An eerie ghost light in the sky startles town in Michigan. The Detroit News, May 5, 1971. Carloads of teenagers, young adults, and a few grown-ups sat along a darkened, desolate road east of here last night waiting for a glimpse of the ghost light that has been reportedly sighted nearly every night for the last 3 weeks. The only light they saw was a red flasher atop a state police car sent to the area for the 4th straight night to control the traffic. For the last few days, rumors of light in the sky and flying saucers have multiplied in this normally stable community about 20 miles north of Mount Pleasant. It has taken time for the reports to catch on, but today nearly all of the community's 2,400 citizens are at least aware that something is happening. Clare, at the junction of I-75, US 10, and US 27, dubbed itself many years ago the Gateway to the North. Many of its hard-working adults make their livelihoods from passing tourists, and its teenagers earn spending money in one of the numerous gas stations, restaurants, and shops. When the sightings were first reported 3 weeks ago, the town dismissed them as a prank dreamed up by local high school students. But almost every night since then, more and more people have claimed they have seen the light. The sighters say it comes at various times from 9:30 p.m. to 4 a.m., but always in the same general area, on Herrick Road, a gravel road which parallels I-75 5 miles east of here. State Police Troopers Charles Ludwig and Lon Kenny of the Mount Pleasant Post have spent the last 4 nights patrolling the area. Cars with light watchers started to get heavy Saturday night, Ludwig said. We received several complaints that they were blocking the road and speeding. The troopers' presence there unintentionally has given some credence to the saucer rumors. I heard tonight that I had chased it at over 100 miles an hour, the trooper said. The only chasing I did was to chase a few kids away. 19-year-old Kim Tyler and Linda Noggle of Clare were among the spectators last night. They had ridden to the area on a motorcycle. I saw it Sunday night, Kim said. It glowed and came over the freeway and was heading right for us, but some guy turned his headlights on and scared it off. I don't know if it's a flying saucer, but it isn't just our imagination, said Richard Reed, 18 of Clare. The only way I can describe it is that it is a ghost light that appears and disappears. Richard and his brother Robert took their mother, Mrs. Barbara Reed, to Herrick Road Saturday night and made her a believer. It is the most weird experience I ever had, Mrs. Reed said. The light first appears coming over a hill near the expressway, then swoops down toward the first car that has its lights on. We watched it come, and when we started driving down the road, it followed us. Francis H. Bowder of Flint, who owns a weekend cabin on Herrick Road, also is a believer. Shortly after midnight Friday, I went outdoors to see what all the cars were doing, and down the road I saw what I thought to be a meteorite flash across the sky. Mysterious glows in the sky and unidentified objects have been reported in various parts of Michigan for the last 20 years. The last major sighting occurred near Hillsdale in May 1966. An Air Force investigating team dismissed the sightings as glows from swamp gas. From out of the clouds it came, whistling, glowing. From the Pontiac, Michigan Press, August 12, 1971. 3 area residents say Thursday's storm brought a flying saucer to Pontiac along with the rain. They claim it dropped out of the clouds near M15 and Dixie, whistled and glowed, hovered and zoomed before disappearing in the direction of Pontiac. Bruce McGowan, 17, of 200 Hopefield, Pontiac Township, William Schultz of Pontiac, and Mrs. Bonnie Gilski of Parview Drive, Independence Township, said they were standing together on a patio outside the Greens Lake Apartments on Parview when they saw the object about 6:40 p.m. All agreed that the unidentified flying object was round or disc-shaped and red to orange in color. Mrs. Gilski says it glowed like an electric stove burner. I couldn't sleep all night Tuesday, said Mrs. Gilski. My husband said it must have been a lightning ball, but a lightning ball couldn't hover like this thing did. Mrs. Gilski says she never believed in flying saucers before, but now I do, she said. I saw it with my own eyes. Schultz said the saucer was visible for little more than a minute. He says he watched it through binoculars until it disappeared. Mrs. Gilski and McGowan, 17, claimed the flying object made a whistling noise, though Schultz said he doesn't remember hearing anything unusual. Schultz said this is the first evidence he has seen of other life in the solar system, though he says he has always had a suspicion that such life could exist. McGowan's sighting of the object, there are no planes like that. His belief in previous reports he's heard that such objects have visited Earth. He says he has an uncle and aunt in Missouri who watch the stars through a telescope and who have reported seeing unidentified flying objects. Sheriff's Department, State Police, Selfridge Air Force Base, and Pontiac Oakland Airport say they received no reports of strange aircraft in the area skies. Walker youngsters see flying object. From the Grand Rapids Press, December 5th, 1971. Steve Lucinort, a Walker teenager, glumly admitted Saturday that a lot of people are going to think I'm lying, but I saw it. I really saw it. Lucinort, 17, of 3360 Remembrance Road, Northwest, said he was driving around a field behind his home Thursday evening when he saw one great big bright red ball with blue and white lights following a plane. A junior at Kanawha Hills High School, Lucinort said he had 5 witnesses, all passengers in his vehicle. My friend Melvin Smith saw it first, Lucinort said. He looked up and shouted, "Hey, it's a UFO." The rest of us didn't see anything but the plane at first, but soon we could see the UFO start to come back toward us. Lucinort said the yo-yo-shaped object zoomed around above the trees and the younger passengers became frightened. He drove them back to the house and returned to the field with Smith. The object reportedly was hovering about 6 feet in the air in the middle of the field. Lucinort drove within 200 feet and got out to take a closer look. But just as I turned off the car lights and got out, the thing started to take off. It went straight up and just disappeared, Lucinort said. He returned to the house and called Walker police, who dispatched 3 men to the scene. The policemen were real nice about it, Lucinort said. One of them said he believed us. My mom thought it might be an advertisement or something, but now she's all confused. She just doesn't know what to think. The last reported sighting of an unidentified flying object in this area was nearly 2 years ago. Police departments all over were deluged with calls in the mid-60s from distraught individuals reporting strange flying objects, which created such clubs as Michigan Investigation of Unknown Phenomena, the National Unidentified Flying Object Committee, and the National Investigating Committee for Aerial Phenomena. Was it a UFO or just springtime? The Muskegon Chronicle, March 9th, 1972. 'Tis almost springtime and time for flowers, kite flying, and UFOs. An object was sighted in the sky west of Muskegon Wednesday night, and before it disappeared, it was observed by police officers of at least 4 departments, personnel on duty at the control tower at Muskegon County Airport, and men of the U.S. Coast Guard Station, as well as numerous citizens. The first call was received shortly before 10 p.m. from Carl Van Dam, owner of Norton Manufacturing Company, who spotted it first as he left his firm about 9:15 p.m. Mr. Van Dam of 480 Oak said that when he first observed the object, it was approximately 30 degrees above the horizon and was giving off a yellowish-white light. He said he then pulled into a car wash on Apple where he and the attendant watched as it traveled slowly across the sky, with the light dimming to blue, then to a green, and then going out. As he was about to leave, the attendant pointed up in the sky, and the object had reappeared, traveling extremely fast, with the light of brighter intensity than before. Suddenly it stopped, he said, about where it was originally, and then the light dimmed and appeared to grow larger in size. Upon arriving home, he telephoned Central Dispatch and talked with Shift Supervisor Ralph Searcher. Mr. Searcher contacted Muskegon Township Officer Fred Taylor. Mr. Taylor stated he too had observed it. Township Police Chief Lawrence Clark then called, saying he was looking at it through binoculars, and to him it appeared to be oscillating and appeared to be real bright and seemed to change colors slightly. At one point, said the chief, I could see it plain as day and it was moving. Other citizens began calling. Most all described it the same way. North Muskegon Police Chief Robert L. Kirshner and Sergeant Harold Merkel also cited it. The Coast Guard was notified, and they too said they had sighted it, as did a Chronicle photographer who reported that it seemed to drift in a steady movement to the west. More citizen calls were received saying that the Coast Guard frequency channel 16 on the UHF band was filled with a code transmission that was so strong it blocked out voice transmissions. The Coast Guard was contacted again, and personnel on duty said they were receiving the coded sounds but were unable to make any sense out of it. They didn't know where it was coming from, a report said. A federal government source said today they were under orders to make no official comment until the investigation is completed. The investigation is being conducted by the Coast Guard District Commander's Office. Sergeant Orville Smith of the Whitehall Police reported he had observed it through binoculars, and it appeared to be moving westerly. U.S. Weather Bureau personnel said today that the winds at the time were from the west at about 10 miles per hour. Even the upper winds were westerly at the time, and they had been for several hours. The Federal Aviation Authority personnel said that the object they were observing was not an airplane, and they also ruled out stars, planets, and even weather balloons. A teletype message was sent to the Operations Center for Michigan State Police in East Lansing, requesting that the Air Force be contacted and a plane sent up to investigate. The reply came back a short time later. Selfridge Air Force 3 is not interested. So, swamp gas, illusion, weather balloon, test craft of some type, or... Woman reports UFOs in Novi. From the Novi News, August 17, 1972. Several unidentified flying objects were spotted in the skies of Novi last week by citizens in the Walled Lake portion of the city. In all, 4 people told Novi police they had seen unusual flying objects in the sky that had to be something more than just shooting stars. The initial report was filed with police by Mrs. Florence McDermott of 2297 Austin. The sightings occurred Wednesday, August 3rd. I was out in my yard about 9 p.m. hanging up the wash when I heard a peculiar noise up in the air, reported Mrs. McDermott. I probably wouldn't even have looked up if it hadn't been for that noise. It was a strange humming sound, almost a drone. When I looked up to see what it was, I saw an oval-shaped object with white lights all around it. The lights formed a ring, almost like a halo, around the oval object. I thought it was unusual because airplanes have red and green lights on them, and this thing had only white lights, and made that funny whirring sound. I know I wasn't drunk, she reported. I, a teetotaling Baptist who never touches a drop. For a minute there, I had to remind myself of that. Mrs. McDermott also called her daughter-in-law, who lives next door, out to see the object, but it had already gone by the time she got there. If it hadn't been for the second one, I don't think I would have convinced her of what I saw, said Mrs. McDermott. My mother-in-law called me outside with a really funny tone in her voice, recalls Mrs. James McDermott of the incident. I was kidding her, telling her she'd been seeing things. While we were talking, I was watching 3 very bright stars up in the sky when all of a sudden one of them took off and flew very rapidly from west to east. Then I got as excited as she was. Shortly thereafter, the 2 women who had been joined by James McDermott, 39, spotted a third object. From what my mother-in-law told me, this one was very similar to the first in appearance, said the younger Mrs. McDermott. It was about as far away as an airplane, and was circular with a ring of white lights around it. I still wasn't sure that I was imagining things until that third one came right over the house. Then I realized that I was seeing something very, very weird. Also seeing the third object was a 15-year-old neighbor boy. It was after the third incident that Mrs. McDermott went into her home to call the Novi police. While she was making that call, approximately 9:30 p.m., the 3 people outside saw yet another strange object. They described it as being extremely bright, like a huge white light. It traveled all the way across the sky from west to east, the younger Mrs. McDermott reported, stopped suddenly in mid-air, and made a right-angle turn to the north before disappearing over Walled Lake. The group reported seeing one more object before police arrived. Like the second and fourth ones, it was reported as being bright and shot across the sky with great speed. The younger Mrs. McDermott denied the possibility that what she had seen were shooting stars. That possibility crossed my mind, she said, and I still think it's a possibility with 1 or 2 of the things we saw. But there were also 2 objects that just couldn't be confused with shooting stars. 2 of those things we saw were very definitely circular in shape and had a ring of lights around them. Those same 2 circular objects also made that strange buzzing sound. I don't know if they were flying saucers or what, but I do know that we all saw something very weird that night. Police officers called to the scene saw none of the objects. The people were extremely excited, said one Novi policeman, and their descriptions compare favorably with other reported sightings of UFOs. It's entirely possible that they did see something. The report is on file presently and will be investigated further before a final dispensation is made. UFO reported over city, from the Ann Arbor News, March 7, 1973. March is the month of flying kites and flying saucers. The kites return each year. Now the flying saucers, or UFOs, are back in the area again after an absence of several years. The return of the UFOs occurred at about 9 p.m. Tuesday when several persons on the city's north side reported to police that they saw an orange ball streak across the sky at a terrific speed. Ann Arbor's 1973 UFO, however, left behind some evidence as to its possible identity by dropping off a fireball which set a tree branch on fire along Barton Drive near Hilldale. Mr. M. David Curtis, a chemistry professor at the university and one of those who cited the strange object, is now examining material deposited on the branch and expects to make a report on its exact identity later today. In an interview this morning, the UM chemistry professor said he is guessing that the material may be wax-impregnated excelsior, and that the object it came from may have been a homemade hot air balloon. But he adds that he won't be sure of the material's identity until chemical analysis is completed. Curtis obtained the small piece of tree branch from Ann Arbor police, who in turn got it from Daryl Pogrowski, 13 of 543 Manor Drive, another observer of the UFO. The Pogrowski youth climbed the tree and obtained the limb for officers. Although Curtis now thinks the UFO may have been a hot air balloon, he says he didn't think it was when he saw the object in the sky. The UM professor says he was driving south on Pontiac Trail near Plum when he spotted the object, which at first glance he thought was a burning airplane. Curtis says he stopped his car and watched the object from 8:50 to 8:55 p.m. as it traveled in a northwesterly direction until it appeared no larger than a tiny star. He says that when it was immediately overhead, the object appeared to be about 10 feet by 6 feet and had an orange glow. He says at that time he thought it was at a high altitude and traveling at terrific speed, but now he believes it may have been smaller than he estimated and closer to the ground. He says he saw fireballs drop off and float toward the earth. 6 youths in the Manor Street area told police they saw a fireball in the sky and that part of the ball fell to the ground and hit a tree, setting it on fire. The youth said they had seen 2 smaller balls of fire fall prior to the one that landed in the tree on Barton Drive. You can really be fooled by these things, Curtis says. A drawing he sketched on a map of Ann Arbor later of the UFO shows it is a vertical cylinder. Checking with meteorologists at the U.S. Weather Bureau station at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, Curtis says he was informed that there was a 20-knot wind at higher elevations which could have carried a hot air balloon along at fairly rapid speeds. But he admits that whatever it was, it looked real spooky. He says the falling fireball took about a minimum of 5 seconds and a maximum of 10 seconds to reach the ground, which would mean a minimum of 800 feet and a maximum of 3,200 feet for the height of the object, considering the rate of speed at which dense material falls. In March of 1966, and again in March of 1967, numerous UFO sightings were reported in this area and around the state. Again in March of 1969, there were UFO sightings reported in the state, but since then there have been few reports. Flying saucers over Oxford. From the Oxford Leader, November 1st, 1973. Seen any flying saucers over Seymour Lake Road lately? If you have, you're not alone. Jan Fleischman and her 7-year-old daughter Kelly claim to have seen not just one, but 2 flying saucers over their home last Wednesday evening at about 8 p.m. I had been with one of my neighbors shopping, said Mrs. Jan Fleischman. She called later that evening and gave my boys a message that she had a pumpkin for us for Halloween. Mrs. Fleischman decided to take her neighbor up on the offer and took little Kelly out to the car with her. As Kelly was locking the car door, said Mrs. Fleischman, she turned to her mother and said, "Mother, there's a flying saucer." Mrs. Fleischman said she was not thinking about flying saucers at the time and didn't believe her daughter until she looked up. There, according to Mrs. Fleischman, was a large, saucer-shaped object hovering over a neighbor's apple tree. It was bigger around than our living room, she said. As Mrs. Fleischman described it, the object was about 70 feet off the ground. She and her daughter sat in the car for several minutes, looking up, she said. After about 3 minutes, a small, similar object came in from the direction of Tan Lake. The larger saucer then moved up, and the smaller one joined it and hovered beneath it. They both moved off to the northwest, where they disappeared at around Granger Road. All of our family believe there is such a thing as flying saucers, Mrs. Fleischman told the Leader. She said the family has been keeping track of UFO sightings for the past 10 years. This is not the first time they have seen saucers, she said. Her son Kevin once took pictures of one, but the pictures did not turn out. And about a year ago last November, one followed the family home from N15 to the Seymour Lake Road, where they had gone shopping, said Mrs. Fleischman. After sighting the object, Mrs. Fleischman took notes and drew a small sketch. According to her notes, what she saw was a saucer-like object with translucent portholes around an inverted dome. The portholes were surrounded by red and white blinking lights. Both she and Kelly agreed that the object was noiseless. Mrs. Fleischman described the top part of the larger flying saucer as being metallic in color, although she says it was dark and she couldn't see it very well. Her daughter described it as white. The top of the object seemed to oscillate, said Mrs. Fleischman. My husband, said Mrs. Fleischman, was working out in the garage and he was real mad because I didn't come in and tell him. This sounds like a fantastic story, but when you see something, I don't know too much about our universe, but I know what I saw last Wednesday. Area woman sifts UFO sightings. From the Oakland Press, Pontiac, Michigan, November 29, 1973. I'm an ordinary person, just a housewife, claims Janet Fleischman, but she's at the center of a flap about flying saucers. She and her daughter Kelly, 7, saw an unidentified flying object right on the front lawn on October 24th, Mrs. Fleischman claims. And since then, she has been in contact with many other persons who claim to have seen UFOs in the North Oakland County area. Mrs. Fleischman has been appointed by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, chairman of the Department of Astronomy at Northwestern University, to be his coordinator for UFO sightings in this area. She recently placed a letter in the area weekly, The Oxford Leader. In it, she asked that anyone observing a flying saucer or other object to contact her at her home. She said thus far she had 152 calls, none of them crank calls. They were all people I didn't know and never heard of. They had actually seen flying saucers, but were all afraid of calling the police or newspapers because of ridicule, Mrs. Fleischman added. Recalling the October 24th sighting, she said about 8 p.m., she and her daughter arrived home and the car was parked in the driveway. Kelly told her to look up, Mrs. Fleischman recalls, and she saw the object above the apple tree in her neighbor's front yard. It was described as about 12 feet in diameter with red and white lights around the bottom. I wasn't frightened. I was stunned, she said. We sat in the driveway watching it for about 3 minutes. Then a smaller one came from the end of Tan Lake. It came right underneath, and then they both went northwest toward Granger Road, Mrs. Fleischman said. She said other people in the neighborhood also observed the object. Mrs. Fleischman's husband, Edward, a machine and tool designer at Pontiac Motor Division, has also observed UFOs, and so has the couple's 2 sons, Keith, 15, and Kevin, 17. Mr. and Mrs. Fleischman said they observed a UFO over Tan Lake last Thursday. The lake is south of their home. She theorizes the objects have affinity for water and are possibly intrigued by the huge gravel pits in the Oxford area. Why does the Fleischman family see so many UFOs? Mrs. Fleischman said it's a matter of being sensitive and that most people don't know what to look for. Even the family's poodle is sensitive and it refused to go near where the sighting was made the following day, Mrs. Fleischman recalled. However, there are others around. In Mrs. Fleischman's letter to the Oxford paper, she wrote, "Many local people, as well as people from other towns, have come forth and said they have seen several similar UFOs. 2 families who work in the Lake Orion area identified the same object I did, exactly, and said they watched this UFO for 45 minutes. I was also told of a UFO landing in St. Ignace, and these people actually saw 3 people get out of a UFO saucer onto the ice last winter. I was also told of a man and his son going inside of a flying saucer, which they thought was abandoned. They totally viewed the inside of the saucer and returned home. Later, this saucer vanished, much to their surprise. These people were also afraid to report their findings. I have many stories to tell now that people are coming forth with what they have actually seen." Mrs. Fleischman is reluctant to give her theories on the origins of the UFOs, but she indicates she does think they are from elsewhere in the universe. She indicated they may be scouting the Earth. This is a war-fighting planet, she observed. Mrs. Fleischman also observed that the UFO sightings come in bunches or waves. There is a pattern in the way they come and go. There's no sightings right now, but I think they'll be back, she said. Mrs. Fleischman was appointed to be a UFO researcher by Dr. Hynek while he was in Detroit to tape a television show with press columnist Lou Gordon, Channel 50, for Gordon's 10 p.m. Sunday talk show. Dr. Hynek is expected to lecture on the subject at Oxford Junior High School January 26, she said. The time of the lecture has not yet been determined. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fleischman will be collecting observations and data. The truth must be told, she said. Police agencies ponder UFO origin. From the Niles, Michigan Daily Star, April 16, 1974. It hovered above the treetops for nearly an hour, flashing red, green, blue, and white signals. Then it disappeared, leaving 4 area police agencies to ponder its origin. The multicolored object was, of course, another UFO, or unidentified flying object. The object was first reported to city police by Janice Washington of 119 Briarcrest, who called in the sighting at 11:24 p.m. Monday. Officers described the object as a bright white light with smaller flashing colored lights, moving slowly westward toward Buchanan from the west side of Niles. The object maintained a 60-degree altitude, police said, and made no sound. Before the strange craft disappeared over Buchanan, officers from the state police post at Niles and Howard townships joined in the pursuit. Police followed the object as far as the Orchard Hills Country Club along Niles-Buchanan Road. City officers said they received several calls during the evening reporting the object. A call to the St. Joseph County Airport in South Bend turned up no clues, and the sighting was reported to the UFO Center in Chicago, according to police. Local couple spots UFOs. From the Marion Press, April 25, 1974. UFO proponents made believers out of a Marion couple early Wednesday morning as they watched two intensely bright objects for a half hour before they disappeared. Mrs. Sanford Sampson, who lives just south of Marion on M66, reported that she spotted the objects from her bedroom window about 5 a.m. Wednesday. She awakened her husband, and together they watched the objects with binoculars for about a half hour before they vanished from sight. The objects appeared to be about the size of jet planes, although one appeared larger than the other, Mrs. Sampson reported. They gave off an intense yellowish-white light and appeared to be rotating. What appeared to be a prong protruded from one side of one of the objects, and because the prong was first seen on one side and then on the other, the Sampsons figured the object was rotating. The Sampsons wouldn't hazard a guess as to how far away the objects were, except that they were lower than stars would be. Besides, Mrs. Sampson said there were no stars out. The objects were traveling in a southeasterly direction. Near Hamilton, Air Force vet spots unexplainable UFO. The Allegan County News Gazette. An Allegan resident and his son, who were returning from a trip to Grand Haven Monday evening, report seeing an unidentified flying object over M40 and 89 near Hamilton. James Cyrus, an Allegan barber, and his 15-year-old son Morgan first spotted the object standing still in the sky as they were southbound on the highway 2 or 3 miles north of Milton. Cyrus said the object's stationary position was what first called their attention to it, as they speculated whether it might be an airplane, a helicopter, or a television tower. They got closer and closer to the object as they approached Hamilton, Cyrus said, until they were nearly directly below it at the northwest edge of Hamilton. He described the UFO as silent and roughly diamond-shaped with several red, blue, and white blinking lights on it. His curiosity aroused, Cyrus said he turned his car around and headed back north toward the object when it slowly crossed the road several times, then sped off to the north. He attempted to follow it, but it went out of sight beyond the crest of a hill and was nowhere in sight when he topped the hill. Cyrus, a 4-year Air Force veteran familiar with many types of aircraft, reported the incident to the Allegan County Sheriff's Department. Lieutenant Rudy Whitney said he contacted both the Holland Police Department and the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department after receiving Cyrus's report, but that neither department had received any similar reports. Whitney described the incident as unexplainable, adding that it's unusual to receive UFO reports from a single person on a cloudy night. Such reports, he explained, usually come in groups on clear nights when stars and other sky phenomena are highly visible. Commented Cyrus, "I swear I was stone cold sober." Cyrus said his son's only comment was, "Dad, promise you won't tell anybody about this except the family." Possible UFO sighted here. From the Roscommon Herald News, December 26, 1974. A multicolored, unidentified flying object was reportedly spotted by a Higgins Lake woman Sunday rising out of the woods near County Road 104. Pamela Lockwood, 151 Lorna Lane, was riding in a snow machine about 6:30 p.m. along the road in Markey Township when it broke down. While she and her friend Mark Sutton, Oklahoma, were trying to fix it, they saw the object. She described it as large and round with red, white, yellow, blue, and green lights. Rising out of the woods, it rose straight into the air and then shot off toward US 27 at a high rate of speed, noiselessly, she said. The sheriff's department checked it out with no results. No sighting was reported by the Houghton Lake State Police either. An area resident was contacted. She reported seeing nothing out of the ordinary. She said, however, that at the time in question, her 2 dogs were acting strangely for no apparent reason. UFO sighted, but not by officialdom. From the Oakland Press, Pontiac, Michigan, June 24, 1975. An unidentified flying object was sighted by dozens of Oakland County residents Sunday night. But if it were up to official agencies of government that are supposed to keep track of such events, you wouldn't know it. There's no record of reports or objects at the Oakland Pontiac Airport Control Tower, or at the Oakland County Sheriff's Department, or at the Pontiac Post of the Michigan State Police. But late Monday morning, people began telephoning the Oakland Press with reports of a strange object in the sky, sighted generally between 9 and 11 p.m. Sunday. About a dozen people called saying they, their friends, and motorists pulled off the road witnessed the phenomena. It was spotted by several basketball players at Harrington School in Pontiac about 9 p.m. above nearby woods, flying in the direction of the Pontiac Metropolitan Stadium construction site. It was also spotted by a family of 6 driving at South Boulevard and I-75 about 10:30 p.m., headed slightly north and then east until it disappeared from sight. And at I-75 and Square Lake Road, at about 10:30 p.m., about 10 motorists reportedly pulled off the road to watch it as it lingered in the area for about a half hour. Yet another sighting was reported in the Sashabo Road area of Independence Township. Generally, the sighter's description of the thing agree. It was silvery and circular, or looked like a flying saucer. And it had lights. Not colored ones, just lights, that showed through its windows. One sighter said the lights, 20 of them, revolved constantly. Another said the lights blinked constantly. And a third reported seeing a series of windows, one very large, that revolved constantly. And as they revolved, a dark space showed up. They reported it was 20 to 30 feet in diameter and appeared to be at the same altitude small planes in the sighting area usually fly at. It made no noise, and it traveled very slowly, the sighters said. And no one knows what the strange object, moving through the sky in the light of a full moon, was. UFO sightings reported by residents near Ashton. From the Cadillac Evening News, July 25, 1975. 5 persons early this morning told the Osceola County Sheriff's Department they watched a UFO near Ashton Lake Thursday night. Linda Hornbuckle, 26, who lives about 2 miles east of Ashton, said the round, disc-shaped object had rotating red, green, and blue lights. It spent a few minutes about 400 yards from her home, hovering over a neighbor's house, then went northward, she said. Mrs. Hornbuckle reported the sighting to the sheriff's department about 12:30 this morning. Sheriff Donald Green said Mary Holmes, 11, of Ashton, originally spotted the object in the same area. She was looking through a window and called to her mother, Sharon Holmes, 30, when she spotted the object. Also reported to be witnesses at this time were Gary Hornbuckle, 25, and Arnold Holmes, 39. Sheriff Green said his department has received many calls on similar sightings. A listing of these reports fills several pages and includes descriptions and other impressions of the sightings. Green said he had no explanation. Couple also sighted UFOs near airport. The Benton Harbor Herald Palladium, November 21, 1975. A Benton Harbor couple late yesterday became the second and third persons to report seeing unidentified objects in the sky near Benton Harbor late Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. William Elsie Peterson, 1881 Sweet Street, said she and her husband were traveling southwest on Red Arrow Highway near Benton Harbor sometime between 5 and 5:30 p.m. when her husband told her to look at three things in the air. Mrs. Peterson said the three objects were a brilliant golden color, resembled a small cigar or pencil in shape, and seemed to drift along in a V shape. She said the objects moved out of western sky to the east until they disappeared. Mrs. Peterson said after the first three objects disappeared, a fourth object, similar to the first three, was also spotted. Yesterday, a Michigan Lutheran high school junior from Benton Harbor reported seeing three unidentified flying objects over Ross Field about 5:30 p.m. Wednesday. Henry Thomas of 1195 Villa Court said he spotted three distinct round discs over the airport. Officials at Ross Field yesterday said they had received no reports of the sighting and had not seen unidentified objects themselves. Mrs. Peterson said the western sky early Wednesday evening had brilliant color and there were no clouds. Concerning the objects she and her husband spotted, she said, "I've never seen anything like it before. I don't know what it was. Could have been anything." Red Ball UFO Stirs Buzz. From the Lansing, Michigan State Journal, April 20th, 1976. To the crew in the Lansing police helicopter, it was an aircraft which suddenly plummeted earthward and out of sight, behind the state capitol. To Ameo Abrigo Jr. of 724 Princeton, it was a large red light which skimmed over treetops near his home after flying over St. Lawrence Hospital. It had three box-like objects rotating around it, Abrigo said, and it seemed to land southeast of him in the downtown area. Another witness described it as the size of a car with 3 or 4 dish-type antennas on it, but everyone who saw the unidentified flying object Monday night over Lansing agreed that it was red, that it hovered at first and then dropped, and that all this took place about 9:30 p.m. Gerald Boda of the police helicopter crew said his craft was over the Michigan Cedar intersection when he first spotted the red light in the sky. It looked to be at about 2,500 feet in altitude, Boda reported, and was somewhere in the area between Willow and Saginaw, and according to his estimates, over Logan Street. At first, the red light on the thing appeared to be the running light of an aircraft making slow movement over the city, Boda said. Then it started toward the ground in a southeasterly direction, directly toward the hovering helicopter, at an angle of about 60 degrees, Boda continued. As it fell, it seemed to accelerate to a high rate of speed and was last seen just prior to impact somewhere in the downtown area just west of the Capitol. Boda said the police helicopter crew didn't see any impact and that an aerial search of the area produced negative results. During the sighting, officers in the District 5 patrol car asked the dispatcher if the helicopter had reported seeing a red ball of fire fall on the west side of the city. It was not immediately known what the police car's position was at the time of the sighting. Police immediately asked the control tower at Capital City Airport if there had been any radar sightings. There hadn't. But police headquarters recorded the names of at least 3 residents about the same time who reported seeing a flying object with red lights. The sighters lived on Cawood, west of St. Lawrence Hospital, at 813 North Logan, 2 blocks north of the hospital, and in the 900 block of West Englewood, a block to the east. All said the object disappeared toward the downtown area. Abrigo gave perhaps the best description of the object from his sightings at his home on Princeton, about 2 blocks east of St. Lawrence. He said he first saw a bright red light come from the west past St. Lawrence Hospital and fly overhead. He took 2 pictures of the object when it was approaching him, and then his wife took another picture as it left. They sighted the object at exactly 9:30. He described it as the size of a weather balloon. The thing made absolutely no sound, Abrigo told police, even though it was just above treetop level. He was certain it went down in the downtown area. Police obtained the film from Abrigo Tuesday morning, but sent it out of town to be processed. UFOs seen by area people Wednesday night. From the Delta Reporter, Gladstone, Michigan, July 14th, 1976. Area people have reported spotting UFOs on Wednesday, July 7th in the Flat Rock Sioux Hill area. All were spotted between 6:30 and 7 p.m. Mrs. James Gruce of Gruce and her son Steve, 3, saw the object flying over their backyard north of Mead Paper. Steve saw it first and pointed it out to his mother, who watched it through binoculars. It was a white, disc-shaped object, Mrs. Gruce said, but it wasn't flat like she had seen in pictures. Instead, it had a large bubble-shaped dome on the top and long rectangular-shaped dark areas, which may have been windows or lights, she added. Mrs. Gruce couldn't tell if the object was making any noise because of competing noises at the time, but noticed that it was not spinning and simply hovered over her area for a while and then left. Regina, 7, and Charlotte Peterson, 4, daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Gary Peterson of Sioux Hill, also saw the flying saucer at approximately 7 when they were outside playing. They went into the house to tell their mother, who assumed it was a helicopter, but the children refused to go out again because of the jet-like noise they had heard. They thought no more about it until later when Mrs. Gruce reported to them what she had seen. Later, the girls were asked to draw a picture of the object, which turned out to be a white plastic saucer shape with a large bubble on top and black looped pipes in the back, exactly as Mrs. Gruce described. It headed in a north-northwest direction over Flat Rock. They showed their parents. Finally, an unidentified flying object was seen by Mrs. Gerald P. Beaucamp of Wells and her twin daughters Jacqueline and Carolyn, 10. The 3 were on their way to visit Mrs. Beaucamp's mother, Mrs. Ed Maringer of Cornell, and as they approached the Sioux Hill Road, they sighted a huge light with smoke trailing behind it. They pulled over to the side of the road to watch it as a car pulled up in back and one in front of them to watch it also. Then the smoke and the light disappeared, and in its place, a parachute-like object came down. Mrs. Beaucamp first thought it was an airplane accident, but saw no debris from a plane and couldn't make out if the dark object at the end of the chute was a person or not. The big parachute, tinted red, according to Jacqueline, seemed to be landing, as it went down toward the Sioux Hill and Gruce area and then out of sight. Although the women didn't report seeing little green men, the sighting of such an object was an experience in itself. Mrs. Beaucamp said Mrs. Gruce was disappointed only because it didn't land in their yard. Ubley woman reports UFO. From the Port Austin Huron News. November 20th, 1975. An Ubley woman Friday night reported spotting an unidentified flying object as it flew over her home on Friedberg Road, about 6 miles south of Ubley. Mrs. Arthur Penny Gagar said Monday morning the object appeared as a bright, white light in the sky north of her home. She said it appeared to sit still for about 15 to 20 minutes and then suddenly flew very fast and at a high altitude over her home heading south. "I don't know what it was," she said. "It looked like a big floodlight." Mrs. Gagar noted that the UFO was very quiet except when it was directly over her home, at which time it sounded like an airplane, but not quite. She said her sighting was confirmed by an unidentified neighbor who cut in on her party line as she was telephoning the Huron Sheriff Department. Ubley Village Officer David Prendergast was contacted and investigated, but did not see the UFO. At Prendergast's recommendation, the Port Austin Air Force Station was contacted and reported that nothing unusual was observed on their radar equipment. The sighting occurred between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. Thank you for watching this episode. I hope you liked it. Which state should I cover next for UFO sightings? Let me know in the comments below. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with everything I post, and it also really helps my channel out. If you have your own scary story or close encounter to share, you can either send it in the comments, post on my subreddit r/ihaveaspookystory, or send it to my Gmail, pinkpossiblystories@gmail.com. Maybe your story will be in a future video. I also just want to do a quick shout out to my best friends Megan and Nick for helping me out this video with how to pronounce city names. So thank you so much, you guys. Love you. Good night, sleep tight, and don't let the shadows bite.